short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
Isn't it funny? The truth just sounds different.
Hello there. Shalom. How you all doing? Yeah, I know, it has been a while. A couple of months at least, I think. It's been an interesting time. Well, this last year, particularly in the last couple of years, have been interesting. They have been for all of us. But particularly the last couple of months or so, I have been struggling to deal with what's going on in the world at the moment, this current global situation. But more than anything else, I've been struggling with the influences from my past that are still having an effect on me. Yeah. So it is a challenged man who is speaking to you today. But I'll get to the point of what this video is all about. Okay, here we go. A while ago, someone contacted me about my video, Spirit and Truth, saying that we have to read Galatians chapter 3 for a good understanding of why we have to live by faith and not by the law. So I've decided to produce this video, which I am appropriately calling Spirit and Truth Part 2. If you have not watched my video, Spirit and Truth, I would recommend you do so before watching this, because I do refer back to it. I'll leave a link in the description. In Romans chapter 1 verse 17, Paul writes, "For the righteous shall live by faith." He is in fact quoting Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 4, and using a concordance, we see that the Hebrew word which Habakkuk uses actually means faithfulness or steadfastness. Also, Paul is talking about the righteous. And we see from 1 John chapter 3 verse 4, which states that sin is transgression of the law, the Torah, that if we wish to be righteous, then we must live according to the Torah. So, the righteous shall live by faithfulness or steadfastness to the Torah. I said in part 1 that we cannot separate the Torah from the Spirit. The Torah on its own is legalism and death, but the Spirit serves to give life to the Torah and brings it to life in us. So instead of the Torah being a burden and a chore, just something which we have got to do, a curse, it becomes a delight and a blessing. King David was described as a man after God's own heart. I think we could also interpret that to say that he was a man who was seeking after God's heart. And he says in Psalm 119, "I delight in the Torah of the Almighty. I meditate on your Torah day and night. I get up in the middle of the night in order to study your Torah." I wonder what might have inspired this sort of attitude in David towards the Torah, towards the law. Could it be because the Torah is a source of blessing and not a curse? Psalm 119 verse 18 says, "Open my eyes that I might see wonders from your Torah." This would imply that the Torah, the law, is the source of revelation and understanding. Here's a quick testimony. I was in the church for 16 years before I got so thoroughly disillusioned that I walked away from it all. I was a youth leader, a youth evangelist, and a worship leader, but I grew tired of trying to make sense of the discrepancies in what I was seeing and what the scriptures said. I went back to my old biker lifestyle until, another 16 years later, Father very miraculously brought me back into his kingdom, and he brought me back with a growing understanding of his Torah, his law, his commands, if you like. After only a couple of years or so, I could honestly say that I had acquired a greater understanding of the scriptures than I had, or I think could have done, in the 16 years I had been in the church. I do not in any way say this to be disparaging to the church, but I found that scriptures which had previously been inexplicable to me, and apparently to the church as a whole, considering what we were being taught, suddenly started to make sense in the light of the Torah. I have said that the Torah, without the life of the Spirit, is legalism and death. And I need to say that it is quite possible for us to revert back into legalism even after our spiritual walk with the Father has been given this newness of life in the Torah. It can again become just that thing we have to do. It becomes very obvious when reading through the New Testament that the Torah is still valid and applicable even to those who were formerly Gentiles and not natural-born Israelites. Scriptures such as Romans 2:13, which states, "For not the hearers of the law, the Torah, are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified." And Romans 3:31, "So, do we nullify the law, Torah, through our faith or belief? No, let it not be. Rather, we establish the Torah." And this is a reference to Deuteronomy 27:26, which says, "Cursed is anyone who does not establish the words of the Torah." And of course there is 1 John 3:4, sin is transgression of the Torah. Yeshua himself said in Matthew 5, "Do not think for 1 second that I have come to do away with the Torah, the law, and the prophets." The latter half of Hebrews chapter 3 clearly equates belief with obedience. This is a crucial understanding because wherever you see the Father talking about belief, you know that he is also talking about obedience. James chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. So also belief, if it does not have works, is in itself dead. But someone might say, "You have belief, and I have works. Show me your belief without your works, and I shall show you my belief by my works." In Ephesians 2:10, we are told that we are his workmanship, created in Yeshua Messiah unto good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Prepared beforehand. I believe this is referring to the Torah, which he gave us from the beginning and commanded that we walk in these instructions. Now some might point out verse 15, which states, "Having abolished in his flesh the enmity or hostility, the law of the commands and dogma," and they'll say, there you go, he abolished the law, he abolished the Torah. But they fail to realize, in fact most Christians I think fail to realize this, that the Pharisees had perverted the Torah by adding to it a great many additional rules and regulations, contrary to the Almighty's command not to do so. And this is the reason why Yeshua came into almost daily conflict with the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites and even children of the devil. Verse 15 is talking about these religious regulations of the Pharisees. One of these rules was that Israelites and Gentiles could not associate with each other. They were to keep separate, even in the temple. The Gentiles were restricted to the outer courts. This separation is not mandated in the Torah, and so the reason for the previous verses 13 and 14, which talk about the Gentile Galatians now being brought near by the blood of Messiah, and the illegal barrier between them and Israel being removed. This is affirmed by the following verses, and is why the dividing curtain in the temple was ripped in two when Yeshua died. Bible scripture interprets itself by itself, and if it should ever actually contradict itself, then the Master himself can be said to be a double-minded man and unstable in all that he does. James 1:8. Assuming that he is not double-minded and unstable, any apparent contradictions within Scripture have to be the result of flawed interpretations on our part. Hanging on to a few sayings of Paul, such as, "We are no longer under the law but under grace," to say that the law has been done away with, and ignoring all the other New Testament scriptures which refute this thinking, is a very grave mistake. It is true that reading Galatians chapter 3, or in fact the whole of Galatians, it can really appear as if Paul is saying that we no longer need to keep the Torah and that simple belief is all that is required. However, Peter says in 2 Peter 3:16, some of Paul's teachings are hard to understand, and ignorant and unstable men twist his words, as they do the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction. And then Peter warns us in verse 17 not to be led astray by such people into the error of lawlessness. What would these people whom Peter is warning us about have been ignorant of? Well, they were ignorant of the Torah, and unstable because, like the man who built his house on the sand, they had not built their lives on the sure foundation of the Torah, that which defines the Father's righteousness and distinguishes right from wrong. This is what Yeshua's parable was all about. So, having said this, and established that we need to adhere to the instructions of the Torah in order to live a righteous life, observance of the Torah can very easily become just a ritual, that thing you do in order to stay on the right side of the Almighty. That which was supposed to bring life in the spirit becomes dead and boring. So, Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. O senseless Galatians, who has put you under a spell not to obey the truth? And don't forget, the definition of truth is given in Psalm 119, verse 142, which states that your law, your Torah, is truth. Verse 2. Did you receive the Spirit by works of Torah or by the hearing of belief? This is another verse which is often used to say that we do not need to keep the Torah, but in fact the opposite is true. Acts 5:32 states, we know that he gives his Spirit to those who obey him. We heard and believed the gospel message and received the Spirit through our first act of obedience in repenting. We did not receive his Spirit by observing the Torah, but we believed and then acted on that belief in obedience. Verse 3. Are you so senseless? Having begun in the spirit, do you now end in the flesh? That is, religious legalism. Continuing in obedience to the Torah can, if we are not careful, become just a religious observance, devoid of the spirit and life that it once had. We must be constantly asking ourselves, why am I doing this? Why am I keeping the Torah? Is it because I genuinely love the Father and want to please him by being obedient? Or has it become just a religious observance? Remember, we are called to worship him in spirit and in truth. I hope that has made some sense. I will testify again that understanding the Torah, learning the Torah, reading the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets, because all the prophets just affirm the Torah, the writings of Moses. I have come to understand so much more in the scriptures by relating things back to the Torah and seeing where the Torah fits in and where they fit into the Torah. The scriptures have become so much more alive, and I would so recommend people taking the time to read through all 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books, Genesis to Deuteronomy. Now I know that Leviticus and Numbers and parts of Deuteronomy can be really quite boring and a bit of a struggle, but it is so worth it. Alright, I love you guys. Many blessings in the Father. Keep safe, and I'll see you again soon. Shalom.